Pokémon was born in Japan as a humble monochromatic 2D game for a portable 8-bit console, roughly 4 months before Super Mario 64 was released, and more than 1 year after the original PlayStation hit the shelves. In spite of releasing in the middle of a 3D dominant video game market, Pokémon made history with the release of Red and Green in Japan, followed by Red and Blue around the world. The possibilities seemed endless: 151 creatures to find, catch and train, a vast region to explore, the ability to battle and trade Pokémon with your friends, among others. But this is only the tip of the iceberg, because Pokémon had much more to offer. A secret Pokémon whose mythical status in-game became a real-life myth as well, in the form of the Phantom Pokémon Mew. Missing No, a glitched Pokémon that allowed players to virtually get infinite resources to raise their favorite Pokémon. As I said at the beginning, Pokémon was released at the beginning of the 3D era of video games. As such, with the success of Red and Blue, it was expected that Pokémon made the transition from 2D to 3D, and it did, although not in the way we expected. Instead of getting a fully 3D Pokémon adventure on the Nintendo 64, we got Pokémon Stadium, a competitive game where we could see our pixelated friends fully rendered in 3D for the first time. I played countless hours in the stadiums, but I wish I had also explored the world of Pokémon 64. I think I understand now why we didn't get that kind of game on the now primitive Nintendo 64. That's because the N64 wouldn't have been able to handle a full 3D adventure in the way we're used to since the release of Pokémon X and Y. If a 3D version of Pokémon Red and Blue for the Nintendo 64 would have been too much for a 64 MB cartridge, that problem would have become much worse as the number of Pokémon increased with the upcoming generations. Nonetheless, it appears that the GameCube had the power to potentially handle a main series Pokémon game, but it's possible that Game Freak's philosophy to keep the main series games on handhelds stopped them from developing a more ambitious game than Pokémon Colosseum or Pokémon XD, two spin-offs of the Gen 3 games. While we got as close as possible to a traditional Pokémon game with Colosseum and XD, catching Pokémon was limited to trainer battles, rather than encountering them in tall grass, dark caves or underwater. When the Wii was released, it appeared as if Nintendo had taken a step back because Pokémon Battle Revolution had the worst of Colosseum and Stadium. The Stadium games had rental Pokémon but no adventure. Colosseum had an adventure but no rental Pokémon. As you may know, Battle Revolution didn't have an adventure or rental Pokémon, meaning that only players with a Nintendo DS and a Gen 4 Pokémon game could enjoy what the game had to offer. At this rate, it seemed as if we would never get a Pokémon adventure outside of a handheld console. Being the second worst selling console in Nintendo's history, it was out of the question to invest money and efforts in a complex Pokémon game for the Wii U, so Nintendo had to wait another generation to finally release a traditional Pokémon game on a hybrid console. In the meantime, Pokémon X and Y for Nintendo 3DS were the first main series games in 3D, and they made a smooth transition into the third dimension. While the game has been criticized for being too easy, a lack of post-game content, and forgettable rivals among others, we could finally catch Pokémon in 3D, customize our playable character, and get access to the player search system, often regarded as the best online system in the franchise. Some players, though, have criticized the transition from 2D to 3D, mainly because the colors of the vast majority of Pokémon look washed out. While Pokémon like Blastoise or Gyarados are of a deep blue color in previous generations, from X and Y onward, they look pale, and the same holds true for almost every 3D Pokémon model in comparison to their 2D counterparts. But the color wasn't the only problem when it comes to 3D models. Look at Mewtwo's sprite in Pokémon Emerald, for example. We can see Mewtwo extending its arm in a menacing way, a pose that doesn't change for the whole battle and that displays the power and personality of this legendary Pokémon. On the other hand, Mewtwo's 3D model looks underwhelming in my opinion, less intimidating even while striking a pose before attacking. In spite of this, we'll see later that these are only minor inconveniences in comparison to the big issues Pokémon faces nowadays. The last Pokémon entry on the Nintendo 3DS was Pokémon Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, and it was also the last time we would be able to use all the Pokémon available in the national decks, because when Sword and Shield were released, we met with one of the most controversial things in Pokémon, Dexit. During the 2019 E3, Junichi Masuda stated that some species of Pokémon would not be able to be transferred to Sword and Shield, which of course was met with a massive amount of backlash. When the Isle of Armor and the Crown Tundra DLC were released, more than 200 Pokémon that didn't make the cut were reintroduced in Sword and Shield, but at the cost of $30 for both DLCs, and still leaving out more than 200 previously introduced Pokémon. This problem carried over to Scarlet and Violet, because out of the 1025 Pokémon, 292 Pokémon were excluded. In my opinion, Pokémon doesn't seem to consider going back to including all Pokémon in future games. Some people say it's because the technology can't keep up with the growth of Pokémon in terms of the total number of Pokémon, mechanics, animations, features, graphics and other elements. However, Game Freak has been accused of recycling 3DS Pokémon models in Sword and Shield. While Sword and Shield director Shigeru Omori stated that the Pokémon models in those games were made from scratch, some people allegedly discovered evidence that the models were almost 100% recycled from Sun and Moon. If that were true, it would suggest that Game Freak isn't restricting content in their newer games because of hardware or memory limitations, but instead due to their tight development schedules, or in the worst case, because they assume most Pokémon fans will buy whatever they release regardless of quality. Compared to Scarlet and Violet, Pokémon Winds and Waves looks vastly superior in terms of graphics and exploration, given that it seems like we'll be able to explore every corner of the region, including underwater sections like in Pokémon Ruby, Sapphire and Emerald. However, there are some questions in the air. How many Pokémon will be introduced? Will every single Pokémon since Gen 1 be available in Winds and Waves? If not, how many Pokémon will the player be able to use? Will we finally be able to explore the inside of more buildings and houses compared to what we saw in Scarlet, Violet and Legends ZA? Let me know if you agree on what I'm about to say, but I think that if Pokémon Winds and Waves carries over the same issues as recent Pokémon games, Game Freak may have to change the formula, and this is where I wanted to get to. It's logical that 3D games have a higher level of complexity when it comes to programming, so if launch schedules are Game Freak's main issue, why not going back to basics? I'm not exactly talking about going back to Game Boy Color graphics, but to 2D Pokémon. Even though 3D games nowadays are the standard, there are critically acclaimed modern indie 2D games. It's true that 3D gives developers more freedom to express their creativity, but if 3D limits the essence of what your franchise was all about, why to insist on 3D if you're not willing to make it right? Fans of the Pokémon franchise have achieved incredible feats by creating fan games such as Pokémon Unbound, regarded as the best Pokémon fan game ever made. Pokémon Unbound is a ROM hack of Fire Red set in the Boreas region that 3000 years prior to the events of X and Y was at war with the Kalos region. The game features all Pokémon from Gen 1 to 8, Gen 8 mechanics, easy, difficult, expert and insane difficulties, character customization, daily events, minigames, a battle frontier, new game plus and randomizers, among many other elements that according to many make this the ultimate 2D Pokémon experience. If Skelly, Pokémon Unbound's developer, was capable of achieving something like this, why wouldn't Game Freak with their virtually limitless budget? As I said before, if time is really the problem, I think Game Freak should really take into account going back to 2D for the following reasons. Number 1, no Dexit. Due to the sheer number of Pokémon, it's expected that some Pokémon are left out in favor of more animations and polished 3D models. This wouldn't happen with 2D sprites due to their size. A 3D model can be up to 1000 times bigger than an animated sprite sheet. Number 2, a much larger world. Recent Pokémon games can feel empty, unpolished. Instead of this, we could have a bigger 2D world detailed with explorable buildings, NPCs, objects, environments, reflections, light effects and more. Number 3, more expressive art. One of the main criticisms of 3D Pokémon is that their models often lack the personality and expressiveness of their 2D sprite artwork. Typhlosion is a perfect example because in its 2D art, its flames are blazing, making it look intimidating. Its 3D model's flames only appear during certain attacks or animations, at least before Scarlet and Violet. Although this isn't related to 2D or 3D, I think Pokemon games should introduce a difficulty system, but one that actually works, unlike Pokemon Black 2 and White 2. I think a lot of Pokemon fans, especially old school ones, are craving for a good challenge to put their knowledge and skill to the test. Honestly, what's gonna happen when Pokemon reaches 2000 creatures, when there are 5000 moves, more complex mechanics, more detailed Pokemon models, each with their own battle animations, among many other things? Unless the power of a hypothetical Switch 3 is considerably greater than that of the Switch 2, I don't think Game Freak will be able to keep up with the increasing number of Pokemon and everything that entails. Until they're able to make a 3D Pokemon game that doesn't sacrifice the very monsters the franchise is named after, I think that Pokemon should go back to its 2D roots and at least include some of the elements that old school Pokemon fans have been asking for generations. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to my channels, and don't forget to leave your thoughts in the comment section. See you in the next one.